All right, hello and welcome to Mount Royal's celebration of International Women's Day, hosted by the Faculty of Business and Communication Studies. My name is Quinn Pelland and I'm an HR student in Bissett School of Business. I'm a member of MRU Women's Volleyball Team and the co-founder of an apparel company called Wearkin. Before we begin, as part of our commitment towards reconciliation and decolonization, we acknowledge that Mount Royal University is located in the traditional territories of the Niitsitapi and the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, the Tsuut'ina, and the Yahe Nakota. We are situated on land where the Bow River meets the Elbow River, and the traditional Blackfoot name of this place is Mohkinstsis, which we now call the city of Calgary, also home to the Métis Nation. And now I want to welcome our amazing guests. Their full bios are on the International Women's Day website, but here with me today is Chantal Sabai, who identifies as she, her. Chantal is the Executive Director of Direct Her Network and CEO of Boardwell. We also have Jake Sticka, who identifies as he, him. Jake is the Executive Director of Next Gen Men. We also have Zabine Jadavi, who identifies as she, her. Zabine is an HR partner and is also a current board member of Ask Her YYC. And finally, we have Katie Smith-Parent, who identifies as she, her. Katie is a business development and industry diversification at Spartan Controls and is also the executive director of Young and Energy, in addition to many other roles and community engagements. So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us. We are so excited to have you here as part of our International Women's Day celebration. The audience of this event is MRU students and recent alumni, and the theme of this year's event is gender equity in the workplace. All of your organizations are engaged in gender equity work in some way, and you're all incredible leaders and activists. So I'd like to ask you all a few questions about topics related to transitioning into the workforce and navigating early careers. So let's start with you, Chantal, first. So something I hear about from my fellow students a lot is the concern about navigating hard conversations. Maybe they're new in the workplace or stepping into a new role. What advice do you have for navigating those hard conversations or those potentially awkward spaces?
Yeah, we'll start easy one, right? No, this is an important question. I think it's important for a couple of reasons. First, super common. So let's just normalize it. It is super common to feel this way. And as part of that normalization, let's also say this is a journey, not a destination. So this is not something you're going to feel once. This is something you're probably going to navigate throughout your career. And so we can talk about some ways to make it feel a little bit more comfortable. The second thing I want to talk about why this is important is that in my observation, when we are joining new spaces or new places, and I'm especially thinking of people joining boards for the first time, there's a common tendency to become a bit of an observer. And while it's completely understandable to want to learn about something before you engage with it, that place of observation, it can be luring. It can be one we want to stay in maybe a little too long because it's comfortable. And I think that if we stay there for too long, it's a lost opportunity for ourselves, and it's a lost opportunity for these organizations or these groups we're joining. So with that context in mind, what are some tips that I would recommend to navigate new or uncomfortable spaces or topics? I'm going to echo some things I share with new board members all the time. So the first is I think that role clarity is your friend. Brene Brown always says clear is kind, and I agree with that. And so in my observation, in addition to this gut instinct of observation, sometimes we have a gut instinct of start doing. And that start doing is often tied to the fact that we want to show our worth and our value. But if we're trying to do something in a group setting and we all just start doing, we will be moving in slightly or largely different directions. And this will become apparent. Now, how it becomes apparent is often through technical things. So let's say we're fighting about approving some contract. That contract we're fighting about, that's a technical issue, and it's actually a symptom. But the root issue is that we haven't talked about what is our role in approving contracts. And so I think one of the best things you can do as a newcomer to a group or a space or even an uncomfortable topic is to ask those simple but important questions. What is our job here? How do we define success? Things like that. You might find that either people are eager to talk about it and just feel like they haven't been given an opportunity, or they're a little embarrassed or scared to talk about it because they've been going on without getting that clarity and they kind of feel they're too far gone. So that's tip one. Tip two is you can ask other questions. And I think bringing a really meaningful question is a great way to engage kind of valuable discussion and show your value. So how do you figure out what that question is? Well, my suggestion would be to come really prepared. And so regardless if you have an orientation to a topic or an issue, one that's kind of delivered to you, you should take a DIY approach to getting a really good orientation. And so that often looks like building relationships with people, seeing the topic or the issue in practice. It might mean really digging into kind of the structure or the culture that the topic or issue lives in. And it could mean like, doing some external research, figuring out what are the trends, what are the emerging issues around this topic. All of that information, if you approach it in a really non-judgmental way, is going to help you form a meaningful question that will be that bridge into that conversation. And then the last tip on this is recognize that if a hard topic you're trying to navigate is around change is a process, change is a dynamic, especially in a team setting. And so I would encourage you to do a little reading on some of the change management literature out there. It can be really helpful for you to understand kind of what to expect for phases that a group has to work through to actually build and buy into change. And one suggestion I have there is John Cotter's 8 Steps of Change. So those are my 3 tips.
Awesome. Thank you. I really, the tip about the process really resonates with me. And I think that's so important and something that, especially as a new grad, it's really hard to trust that process lots of the time. So my next question is, how might this experience be different for men and women or marginalized or racialized employees? Do you have any different tips for these people?
Yeah, so immediately my mind goes to critical mass theory. And so that, for those who are unfamiliar with it, was a study of small group dynamics. And because boards are small groups, that's kind of where I always go. But, there's small group dynamics in all sorts of work settings. And that looked at kind of the power of influence. And so what happened in that study was they put one individual in a room, 4 lines, 1, and then 3 others. And you have to say, A matches with A, or A matches with 1, 2, or 3. And it's a very obvious visual test. And when people do it individually, they get it right 100% of the time. But when people start getting added to that group dynamic and intentionally give the wrong answer, very commonly this first test subject, they conform to that wrong answer, even though it's visually clear and obvious. And so what does this teach us? Well, there's power in group dynamics, and there's power and often kind of challenge or difficulty in being kind of a sole voice or sole opinion. And so if you think about that, if you are the only woman in a group dynamic, if you are the only person of color in a group dynamic, it can make expressing a different opinion harder. And so I would say, it's always like find your allies, try and build groups of 3 or more, because you have some critical mass to normalize an opinion. And so, I think they're just given the dynamics and the industry kind of specifics. So for example, I'm in law. Often as we talk about higher levels of law, we do see that distinguishing where there is more men. It can be harder to raise your voice. And so once again, normalize that, but start to figure out where you can find your allies, where you can build critical mass.
Awesome. Thank you, Chantel. That will be, I think, really helpful for students navigating these difficult spaces. And does anyone have anything they want to add to what Chantel shared with us?
Just knocked it out of the park.
Did, crushed it.
Jay gave me 2 thumbs up, so that's good.
Awesome. Okay, so my next question is for Katie. So we hear a lot about how important networking is for our careers, but it can be really intimidating. So can you tell us about finding our own support networks? And in your experience, where do you find your network and how do you actually reach out?
Oh, absolutely. So for me, obviously, just in general in business development, networking is so important. But I've always gone by the concept of you have to network before you need it. So whether you're looking to make a career move or you've been laid off or you're transitioning cities or anything like that, it's really hard to rely on a network that you haven't actually built up some of that social capital in. So when I was a student, actually networking opportunities were a bit easier to come by. They were at school clubs or nights out, or you had group projects where you were continually meeting new people, and you can kind of feel who's great with, like, works great with you, or something that you're really not that keen on. But then I found like the transition to actually working in the workplace, I had to be a lot more strategic about where I spent my time. So obviously there's opportunities to network internally at your company. So, taking advantage of any rotational programs or volunteering for clubs or those employee resource groups or anything like that is always a good strategy. But I was pretty strategic about trying to marry my interests with my skill sets, and especially the skill sets that I was developing. So I did an undergraduate degree in communications, and I actually have a PR certificate from Mount Royal. And I found when I graduated, I ended up joining some of the professional associations. So the IABC, the International Association of Business Communicators, has a Calgary chapter, and then the Canadian Public Relations Society also has a Calgary chapter. So they actually both had student chapters within that Calgary chapter. And that was really cool to get to be part of it. I got to, know people in the industry. I got to work on some really cool projects. I actually eventually joined the board, and I led their events and professional development for 3 years. So all of that kind of contributed to networking with industry professionals, but also, building my own skill set, especially skill set that maybe I wasn't getting in my day-to-day. And then kind of transitioning that into my work with YWB. Like when I started with YWB, again, I was kind of getting to marry two passions, that future of energy industry and the passion for diversity and inclusion. And what it's kind of come to is all the volunteers that I get to work with, and all of the award winners that I get to meet, and all of the speakers that I get to engage with. Like, again, it's just kind of growing your network. So it's really about, standing up, looking for opportunities, whether internally or externally, but it's really about getting out there and just getting connected.
Awesome. Yeah, I think when you talked about reaching out before we need something, I think that's such a really interesting concept, and something in school we don't necessarily really understand. And I think that's so helpful, especially for me to do that more often and not ask things of people. So I think that's really helpful. And my other question, so for workers who might be tokenized in the workplace, how can they find a network or a safe peer group? Do you have any strategies for that?
Totally. So I think there's some that obviously that like employee resource group that I'm talking about, especially if you join a bigger company, they often have those already organized, whether that's a Pride or LGBTQ plus group, BIPOC groups, gender focused groups, or if you're a working parent, those are often really safe spaces to work through some of those common challenges. But also you can usually get on more the organizing side where you can influence a little bit of policy when it comes to HR. But then obviously there's a ton of external organizations. So everything like YDB, and there's so many other young professional associations, especially as you kind of transition from student to, individual contributor. So I'm part of another organization called Access Connects. And so they've kind of mapped there's over 100 what we call network partners, but essentially they're groups like Ask Her and Direct Her and Next Gen Men and YWB and Equity Leaders. And just all these groups that are working to improve kind of the working experience for women and diverse professionals. So all those affinity groups, like there's honestly something for everyone, like Chic Geek for women in tech, or Fast and Female for women in sport, or there's Black Canadian Women in Action for empowering Black women and girls. Like there's so much out there, and it's amazing where you can really find your niche where you feel safe and you feel included. A lot of them are really like, they're free to join, and then, you can go and engage. You don't have to always volunteer, even though I'm really passionate about how volunteering is really, voting with your time. But it's all about, how can you make the most out of it, meeting people. Like I'm just thinking back to whether you're even introverted or extroverted. I know when we're creating events, we're really trying to be purposeful about making it where it's not just an extrovert's dream. And like, if you're introverted, maybe it's better to join an online club or something like that. So really just playing to your strengths, but understanding where you can find those safe spaces to, work out any experience.
Perfect. Thank you. That's such great advice. I'll open it up again. Does anyone have anything to add on?
I can just tag on to what Katie said about volunteering with your time. I think there's, or voting with your time, volunteering being voting with your time. Don't want to misquote you, Katie. But
I don't think it's my quote, so I'm sure that's attributed to someone, but
yeah, I think that the volunteering world can feel a bit overwhelming sometimes because there are so many opportunities and you kind of don't understand how they can progress and what kind of path they can create for you. And so I think some great tips are like, do something you care about. And so Katie gave a few examples of that, caring about a certain profession, caring about a certain cause, something that means something to you because it is your time, but then not being afraid to understand how your role fits into the bigger scheme. And that might be, director. We do some education to help people understand kind of the volunteer path to the board level. But you can also just talk to people within the organization, because I think there's a bit of a missed opportunity for a lot of folks, and I'm going to pull in like a gender element here. I think a lot of women are really willing to give of their time, and Jake can speak to this, but not as many are represented at the highest levels of leadership in the volunteer world or within organizations that we would consider kind of economically driven, maybe more on that kind of social justice side of things. And so there's no right or wrong choice for you, but I would encourage you to kind of understand the path and the structure you're entering so that you feel empowered to be like, yeah, I'm here for these reasons and I'm going to go here or I'm not, I'm going to stay here, but it's my choice.
And I think whether or not you're on a private board, a public board, or even like a nonprofit board, or even just a volunteer committee for something, I think like, again, marrying that, like if you're really passionate about that cause, you can bring your skill set, whether you're in law or whether you're in HR or whether you're in engineering or whatever, to the board level. But it really is that skill set build where you can start at the, volunteering for your student clubs, and then you can kind of move up. And then that's, those build skills that maybe your day-to-day job won't do or won't do as fast.
Awesome. Yeah, that's a really great segue actually into our next question for Sabine. So Ask Her YYC is focused on promoting women's civic engagement. How can students or recent graduates benefit from getting outside themselves and giving back or getting involved with the community?
Yeah, thanks. Well, Ask Her, we really want to support women by helping them prepare for municipal leadership, but we know that's not for everybody. And so more broadly, what we're really trying to do is encourage women to be more engaged civically. That could be volunteering for a campaign. It could be volunteering on a city committee. It could be volunteering for your community association. So really anything that makes a difference in promoting the life or the quality of life in your community. And it doesn't have to be political. And what I see is that as an HR professional, people who volunteer and are engaged in their communities, they find they bring a lot of really great skills around, good communication skills, a willingness to collaborate. They have experience working with different cultures or different styles of work. And a colleague and I were talking yesterday about how volunteers often have the ability to empathize, which is such a great leadership skill, or leadership trait. And you don't necessarily always get that without having been out in the world experiencing different things. So often we think about the altruistic side of volunteering, but there's also a lot to be gained as well. And I really like what's been said so far about once you're kind of in there, find your path, and there's a way for you to bring skills that you already have, but also a way to take back from your experience and bring those skills to the workplace.
Yeah, that is so true. And I like the way you shift that. That's also benefiting us as well as outward. So I think that's really helpful to kind of change the way we think about that. So also, why is municipal leadership important when we're thinking of gender equity? Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. We see that organizations are often most successful when they reflect the clients they serve. So in the same way, our political leadership would be most successful when they also are reflecting the constituents. And so we want to see gender parity on council so that we are bringing all different points of view, and we're representing the population at large. And that can only happen when women take that first step and get engaged. And taking that first step doesn't have to be like jump in feet first. It can be small actions. It can be writing a letter. If you're unhappy with something, write a letter to your counselor, write a letter to your MLA. Like I said, volunteer on a campaign. So there are ways to get involved slowly without jumping in feet first.
Yeah, that is really helpful also because when I think about that, it just feels like so much. And I think a lot of like recent grads and students would just feel like it's just a huge mountain to climb to even get involved. So just seeing those little steps and hearing that from you is really helpful. So thank you. And does anyone want to jump in and add anything as well?
I just love the idea that like students represent a really large group, especially that kind of new grad. And so like all those municipal or provincial or federal leaders, they want to hear from that group. Like that's the future. So I think even if it's just writing a letter or commenting on social media or seeing at least something that they can actually access and, take to heart and consider, but like gaining access to that group of that generation is really important. So like, don't discount yourself. They want that just as much as they want, 20-year professionals. So.
Yeah.
The only thing I was going to add, sorry, Sabine, go ahead.
I was just going to say I've spent a lot of time at work talking a lot about like ownership mindset. And if you don't like something, you can take action to change it. And so, that's where I would encourage anybody who doesn't like something that they see to take action and not sit on the sidelines. I also do encourage people to really read about and learn the issues before jumping in. Don't get paralyzed, but read and learn and try and understand different points of view and apply your critical thinking skills and bring them to the issue.
The only thing I was going to add, and Sabine just made me think of it as well too, don't just write to complain, write for things you believe in as well too, right? Write in support of things and give that support. And, I'm a millennial. People joke about us that we hate, the telephone and like voicemail is the most paralyzing thing that we do. And, maybe Gen Z, it's like, can we Snapchat our political leaders? So like the act of literally like, sitting down and writing a letter, not many people will take that initiative. So when it does come in a political leader's inbox, they take it very seriously, especially from a constituency as young as students and new grads, because that one letter is representative of a larger population that isn't taking action.
Yeah, that's a really great point. Thank you for adding on to that. So that actually, my next question is for you, Jake. So given that this event is focused on gender equity, how can students and new graduates think about their relationships through a gender equity lens? And why is this also an important discussion for men?
Yeah, I mean, the question is, what's in it for men, more or less, right? And the problem is that when we think about the word gender, we most often think women and girls. And if, we're extra thoughtful, we think trans and non-binary individuals. The last group that we think of is men and boys and how they're gendered and how they show up in a world that, genders everyone. And so, gender equity is and isn't a math equation, but we've been pushing on the gas pedal for women and girls and having a really rich conversation about their roles and identities in society for the past 70 plus years. And we've made a lot of progress and a lot more to go. But simultaneously, because we haven't been having a parallel conversation for, with, and about men, we've been essentially like pushing the brake pedal. And, if you do that in the car, you're kind of spinning your wheels. And so what we really need to do is to move that conversation forward, to be more inclusive of men and boys, help us shift our narratives of our gendered expectations of being, sole breadwinners, not necessarily involved in caregiving, social isolation, struggling with addiction and substance abuse in different kinds of ways, and making the world more gender equitable on kind of all fronts.
Yeah, that's such a great point. And to add on, can you talk a bit about, like, as men support women in the workplace and at home, how can they watch out for benevolent sexism and how can they avoid it?
Yeah, so I mean, that's kind of in the framing, right? Like, I don't really like the term male allies. I'm not going to throw out the baby with the bathwater. We all know what we're talking about when we talk about that, and we need more men that are engaged. But the idea of being an ally requires you to acknowledge the power and privilege that you have in order to use that to ally with someone. And if we don't actually look at why we have that systemic or structural power and privilege, then we are perpetuating benevolent sexism, because we're, putting women on a pedestal, saying that they should be protected or these things should be mitigated or changed for them, but not necessarily questioning, gender parity in payment, equal pay for equal work, or the fact that caregiving duty or unpaid labor isn't equitable, or those kinds of things, right? We have to take that allyship lens on the structure, not just on women's experiences within that structure. And that does transform us as men as well too. So there really has to be the self-awareness and the looking within.
Yeah, I think that's super thought-provoking. And I think it kind of gives me a better way to shift my way of thinking and approach the problem quite a lot differently. Does anyone else want to add on to that? I think that's really valuable.
If I can just add one more thing within that framework. So much of this is often positioned about what men will lose instead of what they will gain from this, right? And so we need to move away from that narrative as well too, as in men giving up power or men giving up influence or monetary gain or status or whatever it is. But what can we gain from this? Deeper relationships with our partners and our children and our communities, better mental health and well-being, less stress of having to be a sole decision maker or a breadwinner, or all those kinds of things, right? There's so much for us to gain and to be invited into that conversation.
Jake, I want to put you on the spot. And so, I mean, you heard what I was talking about. I'm always like, what's the introductory question? What's the bridge question? So if someone is a young woman in the workforce who is trying to engage in a conversation about what you've been talking about, which is kind of this very inclusive gender equality position, what's the question? What's the meaningful kind of bridge that starts the conversation in your experience?
The question, like if it's a young woman graduate,
how do I engage in a meaningful discussion? Is there have you thought about this? Is that the way to phrase it? Is there something that you find are good, maybe question or statement, good kind of introductory bridges?
Yeah, totally. Well, I mean, Next Gen Men's values are curiosity, empathy, courage, and equity, right? And so the first two, curiosity and empathy, curiosity to learn and unlearn, and empathy to build bridges. So if you ask a question that is both curious and empathetic, you're creating an opportunity to learn and to connect with someone. And so, if it's a position of, here's my gendered experience as a woman in the world, what's your gendered experience as a man in the world, right? How have you experienced competition and domination throughout your life, right? How have you experienced relations with other men? Do you wish that they were different, right? Just trying to get people to understand how they show up in the world. And the tough part is, like, excuse the very non-scientific metaphor, but if patriarchy was a stream, there's a current. And for whatever reason, male fish swim with the current, so we don't think about the water. And female fish have to think about the water their whole lives and are like, what the hell's wrong with this, right? But the times that men start to think critically about this current, this stream, is often sensitizing experiences like job loss, divorce, mental health crises, etc. It's often traumatic events. And one of the few positive experiences that men have where they think critically about gender is the birth of a child, because they're handed this tiny human being and told, here, you program this. And if it's a girl, out come the shotguns. We need to protect them from the boys, right? Rather than changing the boys, we want to protect the girls. And then if it's a boy, it's either hand wringing of like, oh my God, I hope they don't, grow up in the same culture of competition and domination that I did, or they double down and say, I'm going to toughen this boy up so that he can survive it, right? And so if that's the entry point for many men to even think about gender, right? Like it's a tough thing, but when you have that curiosity and empathy, and it's also, I want to acknowledge, it's a lot to ask for someone who's had negative experiences in a patriarchal world and gendered experiences, right? But if you have the capacity to do that, it's a great way to invite people into the conversation.
That's great. I'm going to take notes on that. Thank you, Jake. And I think relationship building and that weight, I think that's such a valuable point, because I have a lot of women of color who will say, how do I navigate being the only woman of color on a board? And, we can talk about some strategies. And at the end of the day, I have to say, though, you have to want to wear this weight. It's unfair. It's not right, but you have to want to. If it's not the right experience for you, then there are lots of experiences. So choose what makes the sense for you.
Yeah, that is all very powerful, very helpful. Especially for me, just hearing you guys speak about that. There's so much that we have to think about when we go into these workplaces, and especially the many different lived experiences. So that is incredible. Does anyone else have anything to tag on to there? Or
just to build on what you just said, Quinn, I think and what Chantal was saying too, it can feel really heavy. It can feel really big, right? Like how am I gonna change patriarchy? This is thousands of years in the making, right? Like I just graduated and I have this degree and I'm not qualified to change patriarchy, right? But I think the important thing is, how do we integrate that transformation into the day-to-day of what we do, right? Like when I work with corporations, sometimes diversity and inclusion is unfortunately positioned in a way it's like another thing on top of what you're doing, right? Like the students that are listening to this, they're going to be business professionals, they're going to be arts, in artistic individuals, they're going to be whatever brilliant career that they've changed or they've trained for, but you can integrate it into your day-to-day work. It doesn't need to be apart from, it doesn't need to be different. And then if you have the desire and the will, like Zabine and Chantal said, and even Katie said as well too, then you can find other ways outside of your work to give back further if you want to.
For sure. Yeah. And yeah, just those smaller things. I think that's a good reminder. So just keeping an eye on time here. This has been an amazing discussion. But I want to make sure that you guys all have an opportunity to highlight each of your brilliant organizations and let students know how they can get involved if they're inspired to get engaged after this conversation, which I imagine they will be. So let's start first with Chantal. Can you tell us a little bit about the Direct Her Network and the importance of your mandate and how students or graduates can get involved?
Yeah, so Director Network is all about increasing the numbers and types of women and gender diverse folks in board governance, and importantly, helping those folks start sooner on a path of board governance. And it's important because if you look at kind of any measure of statistic of women's representation on boards, you will see that we are lagging, things aren't at equity, and there's work to be done. And those statistics only get worse when we're looking at it from an intersectional lens. And so our goal is really to say, how can we give people that nudge of confidence to recognize that they really can add value in these spaces. Often it's just demystifying what can be a very kind of exclusive and scary world. But once you have a little bit of the knowledge and terminology and confidence, you realize, yes, I have a space and a place here. And so my kind of call to action would be that if you don't think you ever would belong on a board, if you're kind of interested, or if you think you belong on a board, come check out our training, because I think we'll just help you take that next step, whether that next step is even thinking about joining a committee, whether that step is, yes, I want to be on this board. We can help you kind of navigate what to anticipate, some of the language to anticipate, and some helpful steps to add value sooner. Because as I mentioned at the beginning, I really want to help people feel confident to add value in these settings sooner, because I think otherwise it's kind of a waste of everyone's time, and we don't want that either. And so we do lots of training workshops. We will have one on March 12th that people can look forward, called Board Camp. And you can check us out at directhernetwork.com.
Awesome. Thank you, Chantal. Katie, can you tell us about getting involved with Young Women in Energy?
For sure, but I can personally attest to Direct Her's training, and I highly, highly recommend it. So yeah, Young Women in Energy, or we refer to it as YWE. We believe that young women have the power to change the energy industry for the better. So what we're trying to do is increase female voice and presence and leadership and development in a typically male dominant industry. So we have a number of events and programs. We are recognizing female talent, the ones that are going to lead us into the future, through our awards program. We're building industry and business acumen through our Acumen series and our podcast. We're offering opportunities to connect with like-minded peers through our golf league, our book club, and our soon to be announced online community. So obviously just come join. It's free to join, come participate, attend events or volunteer. You can find us at www.youngwomenenergy.com.
Awesome. Thank you, Katie. And Zabine, how can students or graduates get involved with Ask Her YYC?
Yeah, so at Ask Her YYC, we're really working to advance the principles of inclusive and equitable representation in municipal government. And really our programming is to develop and train candidates and volunteers, supporters, funders, mentors of those who want to run for municipal leadership. And our programs include Mentor Her, Prepare Her, and we're just about to launch another program for those who are early in their career, or early in their thought process about joining municipal leadership, support her. So I encourage you to check out our website at askheryyc.org, and you'll find our programming as well as volunteer opportunities there.
Thank you, Zabine. And last but not least, Jake, tell us a bit about the work Next Gen Men does and what are you hoping to accomplish and how students and recent graduates might get engaged with Next Gen Men.
Yeah, thanks. Next Gen Men is working towards a future where boys and men feel less pain and cause less harm. And the way that we do that is by engaging, educating, and empowering boys and men around gender and equality among youth in communities and at workplaces. All of those opportunities are at www.nextgenmen.ca. And if you are interested in keeping up on kind of like gender related news, but kind of on the masculinity side of things, definitely encourage folks to sign up for our newsletter at futureofmasculinity.com. I'm stoked with that URL.
Awesome. Thank you, Jake. It is so great to hear how many opportunities that recent grads and students have to get involved in all of your guys' fantastic organizations. And that will wrap up our conversation for today. Thank you all so much for joining us in celebrating International Women's Day with Mount Royal University's Faculty of Business and Communication Studies. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you, and we thank you and our listeners for tuning in and joining the conversation of gender equity in the workplace.